potential impact that social change could make. Now, if you happen to be at other universities where they have different focuses based on their mission, then you need to know what those program expectations are and to make sure that they're in your work. Also, different universities have different expectations on what should be in Chapter 5. My lesson strategy here is to give you all the information you need to know, regardless of what university you're in, to be able to produce that chapter in a way that's going to put closure on your research study and bring great credit upon you and your university. Getting right in now to Chapter 5, the purpose of Chapter 5, I'm going to go through several items. You want to make sure you have a pen and paper handy. Of course, you can replay this lesson at any time, but I do find that by taking notes on pen or pencil or paper, that you will actually remember the information more so. The first area I want to talk about is finish the study to graduate. If you're at the point where you're writing Chapter 5, my recommendation is you find some extra time in your schedule and you just get it done. Because the sooner you get this done, the sooner you graduate. This chapter is what I believe to be the easiest chapter of all 5 chapters in the dissertation to write. In the proposal, you probably struggle to get Chapter 1 done because you've never done a research study. You had to get things, if you will, content aligned the way it needed to be for each section. Chapter 2 was probably a bigger struggle because you had to create something from nothing. There's no roadmap. You had to figure out how to write 30 plus pages of content that relate to the body of knowledge that you are an expert in. Chapter 3 was filled with details, excruciating details. But once you got those 3 chapters approved and you were approved to do your study, Chapter 4 was merely identifying all the data and what it meant and presenting it. And for some people, that's a little bit challenging if you've never done that before. But Chapter 5, this is the fun chapter. So I encourage you to go through these lessons, apply them, and finish your study and graduate. Because after all, that's what you started your degree for, right? Now you've got all the knowledge. Now you just got to get through this final phase of creating quality in the final chapter of your work. Finalize the research study. The purpose of Chapter 5 is for you to finalize the whole study. Remember, in Chapter 1, you gave a brief description of what's going to occur and why you need to do the study and some support for the research method and design. Chapter 2, you went in and gave a good review of the literature. Chapter 3, you talked about how you were going to do your study, what the research method and design would be, particularly in the proposal, and the dissertation now it says what it was. Chapter 4, you put all the data together, you presented it. Now Chapter 5 is you're going to finalize the study. You're going to put closure on the document. Keep in mind, some people may never read Chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 of your work. They're just going to want to read Chapter 5. It's not uncommon that people just want to see what the recommendations are and what your findings were from the data. Chapter 5 is going to provide several items that allows for this closure for you to finalize the research study. And I will go into all those throughout the lesson strategy, not only in this lesson where I'll talk about several of them, but throughout this series of all 12 lessons. The purpose of Chapter 5 fundamentally is designed for you to infer from the data that you found and create meaning. Data is what it is. If you did a statistical test and you either rejected or failed to reject the null, then that is an outcome. That's data. That's a test. Now, what does that mean? How does that answer the research question? How does answering the research question help provide meaning back to the stakeholders who were suffering from the specific problem that you wrote about? Even if you're doing qualitative work, when you should happen to produce information from a phenomenological study or any kind of case study, what you're going to have is different type of narrative feedback. And from that, you're going to have to infer what information that means based on maybe common themes or areas that people agreed that were the same, and you're going to have to create meaning from that. I believe the fundamental purpose for a doctoral dissertation is to create data from the data collection. Then take that data and produce information. That information is the meaning. And then take that information or that meaning and give it to the people who are suffering the problem. Because in essence, that's what you're all about in doctoral dissertation. Help people to lessen the problem. And we do that through data so that they can make better decisions. Chapter 5, part of the purpose is for you to suggest what the data means to you. Not what it means to somebody else, not what it means to your committee members, what it means to you. You may get all the data and look at it, and you may provide some sort of meaning behind that. I could look at the same data and I might have different meaning. It doesn't mean that I'm wrong and you're right. It doesn't mean that I'm right and you're wrong. All it means is that we have different interpretations. Now, when your committee members work with you to solidify your chapter, they're going to make sure that what you write is logical. Logical in the sense that the data actually suggests what your meaning is that you're writing about. Chapter 5 is the opportunity for the author to suggest what that data means. So as other people read your work, they can gain your insights and not only see what the data produced, but read your rationale for the recommendations and conclusions you make. Chapter 5 closes the loop. Now, this is something I find an error in most early drafts of dissertations, is that the student doesn't close the loop. What do I mean by that? By closing the loop, I mean that somewhere in Chapter 5, perhaps near the end, that you indicate what that data means and how that data answers the research question, or research questions, depending on how many you have, and how the answering of those questions goes back to provide information related to specific problem. Remember back in Chapter 1, you had a general and specific problem in the problem statement. You also had identify that your work is going to be significant to different stakeholders in the significance of your study section of Chapter 1. Ideally, everybody that you mentioned or each stakeholder group in that significance of the study section, you will write to in Chapter 5. This is closing the loop. It's bringing closure to your chapter and showing how everything you've done through the recommendations and conclusions and what you're inferring the data to mean can be used by somebody else, the same people you wrote about in Chapter 1. Also helps close the loop in what your research does to the body of knowledge. Your research somehow should add some contributions to its related body of knowledge. Perhaps you help to close a gap. Or perhaps your data help to reinforce what's already there in the body of knowledge. Or you might be shifting the body of knowledge, which is not uncommon in doctoral dissertation work, because after all, you're an expert and you spent 2 years doing this. It's not impossible that you have the opportunity to make a huge difference in the related body of knowledge to your study. Chapter 5, purpose, extends to you, ensuring that all the findings are grounded in the data. And I mean that every time you make a recommendation or conclusion, you suggest the findings of the data to create that meaning, that you're grounding it. I always tell students to keep this in mind. Help the reader understand where every conclusion, every recommendation, every implication, where it was born in Chapter 4. What data reflects this information? I'm not one of the faculty members who believes a student should put in his or her own personal opinions on what the data means. There's a place for that in certain areas. But ideally here, what you want to do in Chapter 5 is ground your work. Because if you don't ground your work in the data, why did you collect the data to begin with? Ground your work in the data. If a faculty member or a university person says they're looking for your ideas, they're looking for what you mean, they're not looking for your opinion, your unsubstantiated opinion. What they're looking for is your data-based information and findings where you're grounding it. And I always find that if you can ground every idea in the data in Chapter 4, you'll go right through and your approval will be much more easier than if you don't ground the data in where your ideas were born from. I talk about this a lot in this chapter about grounding the data. And you'll find that this to be a very important salient point to carry through as you move through developing your own chapter. Part of the purpose of Chapter 5 is to inform the reader of this study's value. Your study will have value somehow, some way. Some of you will create more value than others. some of you will have the opportunity to take your work and make it super substantial and significant. And I say super in the sense that because we all do different types of dissertations, we all don't know exactly who is going to benefit from your work. But by the time you get done with your study, you're going to have that opportunity, and that's why you're going to relate to how the value of your work has its potential to help others. For example, in my research study, when I did my dissertation on the cause and effect of a corporate fitness center, I didn't know exactly what the value would be when I started. I had some assumptions, but I didn't know until I finished my study that the CEO of the company was deciding what to do with that fitness center, to either leave it as it is, close it, or invest more money into it, make it better and bigger. Because of my study, the value was for that CEO, he decided to not only keep it, but invest more money and make it even bigger and better for the employees. Depending on what you're doing, perhaps you're creating a dissertation research study that's based in healthcare or in education, where you really have the opportunity to help people, their lives, or their education. In your study in Chapter 5, you get to inform the reader of the value of your study. Not asking you to add in any more value than what's really there, but your work is going to be significant, substantial. The question is how significant, substantial, and to who. When you can identify that, which you will in the findings, then you're going to be able to satisfy this criteria, as well as in some of the recommendations that you're going to make. Within Chapter 5, particularly when you start talking about the findings of your study, you are going to inform to a certain degree what went well in your study. What worked well? Did you get more people to turn the surveys in that you anticipated? If so, why? Oftentimes I see students write their work and they say they not only met but exceeded the amount of return surveys that they needed. That's a great thing. Now tell us why. What did you do? What went so well to help you to be able to do that? Did you do some follow-up emails? Were you asking people as you walk down the hall, hey, don't forget to do my survey? Because this is what's going to help other researchers. In conjunction with that, you will also inform the reader what did not go so well. For example, let's just say you were going to do 20 interviews until data saturation achieved in a phenomenological research design. But it actually took you to get to 28 people until you got data saturation. That's fine. That's still good research. But tell us why it took you so long to get your data saturation. Perhaps your research design was broader than you had thought it was, and therefore when you asked the interview questions, you got many different responses instead of more focused effort in the responses from the collective group of people who answered your questions. It's important to understand what went well and what didn't go so well for a couple of reasons. One is in your future, you may be doing more research. If all goes well, you will, because you'll apply what you learned in your doctorate degree. You'll move from a scholarly or an academic researcher, perhaps to doing research for your organization or getting involved with a nonprofit or just helping other people in general to do research better than they could otherwise. Another aspect of what went well and what didn't go so well is for the reader, when they look at your work, if they want to replicate your study, that they can learn from you and they can decide based on your input what they should do or perhaps what they shouldn't do, maybe perhaps what they could do better. You get many opportunities in Chapter 5 to provide a lot of rationale. And again, what I'll indicate here is the early chapters that I see being drafted that don't get approved, even at the committee level or even at the university level, is that rationale is missing. These pieces are not there. That's the beauty, I believe, of the program that you're listening to, that I'm providing you this information so you can build it in early and therefore take that preventative approach. The purpose of Chapter 5 also is to communicate outcomes. You want to clearly communicate the outcomes of your study. This doesn't mean you have to use, fancy words or long words that people don't really understand. It's not to give some sort of convoluted word choices that suggest your degree made you far more arrogant than anybody else. In essence, the reality is your Chapter 5 should be written at a level where somebody with a high school degree could understand it. Definitely somebody who is a senior leader of an organization who may only have that high school degree. Perhaps they have a college degree or a bachelor's degree. Those people need to be able to read your study in a way that's going to allow them to understand what you wrote so that they can take the findings. Oftentimes, students like to believe falsely at the end of their dissertation that now they're supposed to start putting in all these big words and all these phrases, this academic type of writing that you find in some of the most, obscure journals. This is not true. I find that the more clearly you communicate your ideas in paragraphs that flow well, in sentences that are designed well, the easier it is to get your work approved. Now, you can go the other route and you can make it as complex or convoluted as you want, but I'm trying to help prescribe ideas that I know that work. It's understandable that some aspects of Chapter 3 and 4 and even in Chapter 2 are going to be complex, because when it comes to research, it comes to some of the theories and how you relate to them. Higher order levels of critical thinking have to be communicated in certain ways. That's not to say in Chapter 5 you will not have higher order critical thinking skills reflected, but you're going to have it done in such a manner that allows for an easy flow of information. In most cases, the reader should be able to pick up Chapter 5, read right through it pretty much nonstop, and by the time they get to it at the end of it and say, wow, that was well done. Now I want to go into some of the areas of the content that's in Chapter 5. These areas are predominantly what's going to be in the follow-on lessons in this chapter that I'm providing in the follow-on 11 different lessons. One of the first things you want to do and realize that part of the content is that you're going to summarize. You're going to provide a summary of everything. You'll provide a summary of what happened with your research from the beginning phases. It's not going to, you're going to repeat everything in chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, but you're going to do a summary of what happened, what was basically done, what the purpose statement, what the research questions are, if you have hypotheses, or what the outcome was. But what you're going to do here is you're going to summarize Chapter 4 data. You're going to take Chapter 4 and look at it from what I'll call the macro view. First, you're going to summarize what does it all mean. For example, if 2 out of the 3 hypotheses that you had were rejected and 1 was failed to be rejected, what does that mean in broad terms? Help the reader to get a sense for what the data means. If through your qualitative work, if you did a phenomenological study or a case study, you had certain common themes that came out of it, well, here in your summary, you're going to indicate what those big themes were and basically how they were derived. In Chapter 5, you're going to do an interpretation of the findings. Once you get the findings and you move past that summary, now you're going to go in details. You're going to show exactly what did it mean when you failed to reject the null on each individual question. It's not uncommon that you'll identify each research question and then address each research question one by one on exactly what were the findings for each research question in regards to that statistical testing of a null hypothesis, or perhaps on those research questions that were based on your qualitative work. You're going to put everything into a context for the reader. And one of the contexts that you're going to look at is the context of the body of knowledge. Remember, you did your study in an organization, and that's certainly important. But now we're going to look at where does your work fit in that context in the body of knowledge. Remember back in Chapter 1, you wrote about your theoretical or conceptual framework. Where does your work now fit in there? Does it extend that literature? Does it do anything to that literature? It's not uncommon that some people do a dissertation and the findings are consistent with all the other research. That's not a bad thing because it helps to reinforce what's there is still valid. Now the point is, with this context, is what's the context of your work in the bigger scope of the body of knowledge, or perhaps even in the application on what's going on with your recommendations in regards to what leaders in an organization could use. You're going to write about the implications of the findings. Now, if you went back to the significance of the study section in Chapter 1, there you wrote about what the potential of your study is. Now here, you can really expand upon that and say what the implications are. Let's say, for example, you did a study on nursing burnout, and you did it in a hospital in Central California. What's the implications of the findings there? Can you imply from there that it's all the nurses in the entire hospital, in the entire hospital setting of California? Can it be expanded out across the world, wherever there's nurses who are experiencing burnout? Depending on your data, depending on your study, it's going to relate to how much information you're going to have here and the implications of your findings. Now, I don't encourage you to be overly, boisterous about this. Be realistic and look at what was generalizable out of your study, if anything, and then who could benefit from this work as well. Perhaps one of the implications is that your findings can now produce some sort of training program that then could be used by hospital leaders to help reduce burnout. There's nothing wrong with implying something like that if your findings actually suggest that. If they're significant, substantial, then you have an opportunity to really write these implications in a way that could bring that great credibility to your work. In Chapter 5, you are going to write about the limitations. Now, in Chapter 1, you projected what some of the limitations of your study would be, or potentially could be. Now the study's done. What's the limitations of your study? Is your study limited to a small group of people? Was the research method and design done well? Was there a limitation on your work because perhaps you ran out of time, or perhaps you didn't get enough people to do the survey that you hoped for? Perhaps you were hoping for at least 150 surveys to come back. When you did a quantitative study, you ended up with 80. Well, 80 may not be enough points of data to run your statistical analysis to be able to suggest something of broad scope. So therefore, the limitations of your work would be that you didn't meet a certain number, so there's some limitations of your study's findings. And that's okay. You'd still have some implications, but now you're going to address limitations. These are two separate things, although at times they can be related. Part of Chapter 5's content is the recommendations. What recommendations do you have based on the data? What are the recommendations for those stakeholders? Think of it this way. If you wrote about 3 different stakeholders in Chapter 1 who your work could be significant to, well, of course, one of them is the survey population. What's your recommendation for that survey population? If you're talking about, let's just say it's a university and it's about grade inflation, and your study has something to do with grade inflation and why there's this perceived grade inflation. If you did a study and you found out certain information related to grade inflation, what's the recommendations perhaps to the faculty members? What's the recommendations for the students? What's the recommendation for the academic institution? Because each of those 3 people, and there's probably more that are stakeholders, you can make your recommendations for each one based on the data that you have. What's the contributions of your study? Now, sometimes these start to get convoluted when you talk about the implications and the recommendations. What's the contribution, and particularly here, to your university's mission? For example, at Walden University, where I graduated from, the contributions of the study here would first and foremost be related to how my study had some sort of social impact or some change in society. If you're at any other university, let's say, for example, you're at the University of Phoenix and their mission is leadership. What's their contribution of your study to leadership in your discipline? So, for example, if you're in healthcare and you're working on a Doctor of Health Administration at the University of Phoenix, there should be some contribution to leadership in healthcare. Think about, first there's recommendations what people could do, then the contributions of your study, and think of that more so to the body of knowledge and to the mission of your university. All too often, again, I'll see people make some contributions based on their survey population, but they forget about that mission purpose that we all are governed by when we do a dissertation at a university. That's what helps distinguish one university from another. Now, your work and the content, I'd like to see, and I think it's important, and I believe most people agree, is that what is the future direction of the body knowledge and related research to your study? What do you predict? What do you project for the future based on what's already in Chapter 2 and this new data that you found to perhaps lessen that gap or provide new information or to extend the study to a new location as compared to what other people have done? Is the future of the body of knowledge shifting, or is it staying the same? For example, leadership body of knowledge. I don't know if it's shifting. It's certainly getting deeper, and it's widening to a certain extent, but it doesn't seem to be really shifting as it did perhaps in the late 1800s and the mid 1900s, and maybe perhaps even in the 1970s and 80s when there were different aspects of different work groups going into the workforce. Now, what's going on in your field? That's a guess. I understand that. But you're the best person to be able to guess that, because you've done all the research, you've done the literature review. Now you see what your work has done, and based on perhaps even the contributions, you can see what's going on with the body of knowledge. And this is important because other people who are studying something similar to you may look at your work and say, what do they perceive as the direction of the body of knowledge? This is another area where I see a lot of students don't include anything on this. And then they get asked to, or oftentimes they're not even asked to, and I believe there's a gap then in that dissertation, a failure to be able to provide the reader something different and something helpful beyond what the expectation was perhaps, or even offer it because you may want to go into somebody's dissertation and find out where's that direction moving, if it's moving at all. And then, of course, like every chapter in a dissertation, chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, each chapter starts with an introduction section. That's roughly a page, maybe a page and a quarter, which gives the reader an introduction to the study. And then there's a conclusion that wraps it up. It helps the reader to put closure to what's in that individual chapter. Now, as you provide your conclusion, you don't have to put a conclusion based on the whole dissertation. You would allude to the purpose and then the major findings and close out. Keep in mind, a reader may never go into your chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. In your introduction, you have to give enough information so that the person could get a sense for what was the problem, what was the purpose, what was your research method and design, and basically then get into your outcomes. Now I want to talk about a few salient points. Now these are what I believe to be characteristics of areas you need to address throughout the chapter. Now some of these areas are just as important in other chapters, but some of them are unique to this chapter. But I want to make sure that you know this here, and if you haven't incorporated some of these ideas already into perhaps chapters 4 or the prior chapters, now it's probably a good time to do it while you're writing chapter 5 before you submit it for approvals. Again, ground everything in data. Everything in Chapter 5, every time you make a recommendation, you infer something, you give some implications, ground it in the data. I'd like to have one paragraph per recommendation, and in each recommendation, that recommendation is then directed to a certain point in Chapter 4 of a data finding. It may be based on the rejection of a null or the failing to reject a null, whatever the answer to the research question is. It may be a common theme that was found when you did your analysis of qualitative work, but ground everything in data. You'll find your work will be far better, it'll be approved easier, and you'll find greater clarity in your work as well. Higher order critical thinking. Keep in mind, higher order critical thinking skills are not merely synthesizing. You move long beyond that. You're beyond synthesizing what was in the literature. You're adding to it. Now you're inferring. When you start to infer what your data meant to the body of knowledge, when you start to infer what people can do as regards to recommendations, or you infer what some of these conclusions are, you have taken that synthesis, now added your material to it. Now you're really at the evaluation stage. You're analyzing what happened. You're analyzing your research. You're evaluating whether what went well, what didn't go so well. Higher order critical thinking is now important for you to focus on. If you're not sure what this means still, I encourage you to go online. go into Google and go into search engine and type it, what is hierarchical critical thinking? You'll find millions of hits there more than likely. Or you can put in there Bloom's cognitive taxonomy. You will get a graph and it'll show you exactly what hierarchical critical thinking is, and you can actually look for the verbs of Bloom's taxonomy. Write more in the higher order level. Like, for example, don't just indicate what the data meant. Indicate by the data discriminated against the other data, or a discrimination of data suggested something as compared to data just showed this. When you start to incorporate the critical thinking, the level of your work starts to improve. And more than likely you're thinking at the higher order levels, but all too often students tend to write at the lower levels. But chapter 5, some of the salient points, is going to be that critical thinking should be seen and even felt at the end when somebody read your work. Again, clearly communicate everything in this chapter. Just keep each section very simple. This is why I encourage students to write just one section at a time. Don't get involved in writing the whole chapter. If you're going to talk about recommendations, just write the recommendations. Maybe you're going to have 3 paragraphs. Maybe you're going to have 6 paragraphs. But you know what? It's easier to write those 3 or 6 paragraphs than worried about whether you're going to write 17 pages. You may end up with 17 pages, and later, after you get all these sections put together, then you can work on the whole chapter as an entity and make sure that it flows well. Just like I prescribed in all the other chapters. Incremental gains. Small steps of progress over long periods of time collectively add up. It's far easier to write 3 or 6 paragraphs than it is 16 pages. Close the loop. Close the loop. Close the loop. And I'll bring this up pretty much in every lesson. Make sure that you're closing the loop. When you make recommendations, make sure you're making recommendations on all the stakeholders you wrote about in the significance of the study section in chapter 1. Make sure in particular that your stakeholder group where you did your survey, that survey population, which are the exact same people you wrote about in the specific problem that you're writing in your work, how this loop is being closed. There are many areas in chapter 5 to close the loop. As I go through the other lessons in this series on chapter 5, I'll talk about each one of those and how you can perhaps maybe create yourself a little checklist to make sure that you have closed the loop. This is going to make your chapter 5 very powerful. As I always say, KISS. Keep it simple, student. Keep the chapter simple. This should be the easiest chapter to write. It should be the most fun because it's your analysis work. It's what you infer. It's what you believe the data suggests. It's what you believe can be used by the stakeholder groups that you are helping out. So keep it simple. Keep the paragraphs maybe 3 to 7 sentences each, maybe an average about 5. Keep it flowing well. Make sure that you're not overly redundant. Just communicate clearly so the reader can go through your work, get from it what they need. All the time I tell students, write to the reader who's going to read your work 2 or 5 years from the time you're writing it. I know you have no idea who that person is, but you can get a sense for that. If they never met you, when they read your work, that they could walk away with a sense that, wow, this is a good study. The essence of your work is significant. It's substantial. As far as the reflective summary, I gave you a brief introduction to the ABD program. This taking the B out of ABD is designed to help you get through your work quicker and better. Chapter 5, purpose, I went through the information so you know really what the purpose of Chapter 5 is. I believe that if you know the purpose and then you know the expectations, you can not only meet those expectations, but you will exceed them. I gave a brief introduction into the content areas. Those content areas that I addressed, such as the implications, the conclusions, that will be the subsequent lessons that I'm going to address in this program on Chapter 5. And then I talked about some of the salient points. Remember, always close the loop. Be specific and clear. 3 things I always talk about with students all the time is write in a manner that's specific, succinct, and purposeful. And I mean purposeful in every word choice. The better you communicate, the easier it is for people to appreciate your work. And more importantly, what you're concerned with up front when you're working on your chapter is to get it approved so you can graduate. The next lesson that follows this will be lesson number 2, and in that lesson I'll address the summary section and the interpretations of the findings sections that you'll be writing about in your chapter 5. When you're ready, go ahead and move right into that lesson. I do believe that chapter 5, the essence is get to it as quickly as you can and then get her done so you can graduate. This lesson sets the pace for the following lessons in chapter 5. I appreciate your support. Again, if you have any questions, you can email me directly through my website, or if you have any other email, or if you're on a webinar series with me, take a look at emailing me or asking me questions if you have them. I'm happy to answer them. If you're interested in any of my other programs, you'll find them on my website, and I look forward to hearing great things about you and your work, in particular when your dissertation is approved. Thank you.